For years, DC has tried to compete with Marvel. But while Marvel was trying to build an entire universe by knowing exactly what they wanted to make, DC almost felt like a Marvel imitator. And this is where things get complicated. Because before DC was trying to beat Marvel, it made some of the most incredible superhero movies that couldn't be more different from Marvel. So today we are ranking as many DC projects as we can, from the ones that are absolute gems to the ones that maybe should have stayed forgotten. Let's go for 1,000 views for a part 2. Aquaman is probably the most perfect example of a DC movie done right. Because instead of trying to be the next Avengers film, it's just focused on being a really good solo adventure movie. And that works. The journey to find the Trident is simple, but it keeps us moving with fun action, creative worlds, and a lot of energy. The only real problem is the first act, as a lot of the characters are not really that important, as a lot of screen time is spent on characters that feel important, but are basically background characters after the first act is finished. But, weirdly enough, I can still look past it because of everything Act 1 set up. This movie has a lot of heart, and that carries it. The villain is also where things get weak again. Orm is fine as a villain, but he's never really given any depth to make him interesting, or to make us feel him. He mostly just exists to create conflict. But with the adventure and fun storyline, this movie starts us off with a hero tier. The Dark Knight is one of those movies where you can instantly tell you're watching something special. The opening scene alone shows us exactly why Joker works. It doesn't spend 10 minutes explaining him. It just lets the incredible action speak through him. A few criminals, one badass plan, and suddenly you know how dangerous he is. And the most shocking part? The villain wins. Years before movies like Infinity War showed us just how far a villain could go, Dark Knight was already all over this development. And no, everybody, you're not going to see a video from me about how DC can predict the future. So, just remove that from your mind. But anywho, the Joker wins! And not only that, Batman covers it up, allowing his reputation to fail, so that Gotham City can thrive. That ending is what makes this movie unforgettable. It's not just about Batman versus the Joker. It's about how far Bruce Wayne is willing to go to be the hero. He is essentially giving up Batman and his need for justice just so Gotham can have a chance. This movie is not only one of my favorite Batman movies, but deserves its place in the Hall of Justice. Oh no! I feel an evil chill in the air, as if this is somehow foreshadowing negative consequences that will derail our proceedings. Justice League is the dictionary definition of a movie that happened way too soon. DC was trying to do the big crossover before the characters were ready. And that's the biggest problem. The characters feel like they are there because the movie needs a team, not because the story naturally brings them together. Aquaman is basically missing from the first half until they went, oh no! Aquaman was on the poster! And when he does join, Aquaman still doesn't have that much to do. The Flash is another great example of not being ready. If we got a Flash movie first, we could have easily created a very cool parallel between Flash's fear of bugs and Batman's fear of bats. But because this movie is happening way too early, they have no time to expand on those similarities and ideas. The movie basically spoils the Superman twist. The movie basically spoils the Superman coming back to life twist. Even the poster spoils this. Really, Warner Bros? You really think you can kill off Superman in their third movie? As if. This whole movie feels less like a story that needed to be told and more like a giant publicity stunt. Banishment Teal. Suicide Squad is a complete embarrassment to DC. The characters are forgettable action figures that are completely uninspired. Everyone gets a flashy entrance, but no real development. Their arc, or should I say their shared arc, is basically the traditional, we don't like each other, but somehow we learn to get along. Amanda Waller also feels like a wasted opportunity, but she mainly just exists for exposition and then just goes to the corner until she's needed. Joker is barely in this movie. He is a joke. But he shows up just long enough for everyone to say, hey, look, it's Joker, and then move on like nothing happened. The story itself is also incredibly messy, relying heavily on information we are just supposed to accept, instead of building to anything meaningful. And visually, it does not do itself any favors. A lot of it is just flat and forgettable. Like the creators are just going through the motions instead of actually trying to tell a story. So yeah, Banishment Teal. Peacemaker is one of those shows that really surprised me because on paper, it should just feel like a random chaotic spin-off with unknown DC characters. But instead, it ends up being one of the most character-driven DC shows. For most of the season, there is no traditional villain. Instead, it's just a show about people who love each other. And that's kind of the point. The relationships are the conflict this season. They don't need to have a villain. More on that when we talk about season 2. Especially the bond between Peacemaker and Leota. Their relationship works because it's not about fixing each other. It's about loving each other for who they are. As they slowly bring out the best of each other, the show also does something really smart with Peacemaker himself. It never lets him off the hook for all the bad things he's done, but it also doesn't make him the butt of the joke. And that push and pull dynamic with the characters is why they so flawlessly work. Amelia Harcourt also stands out because she creates conflict in a way that actually feels grounded. And even when she is harsh, she is usually right about what's going on. The show just ignores it until it's too late. And of course, the intro deserves its own mention, a ridiculous flash mob that somehow sets the tone for everything this season is trying to be. Hall of Justice, but there is no topping the superiority of The Dark Knight. Blue Beetle is a decent, heartwarming movie that is way too ambitious for its own good and should have been a series. The biggest strength is Jamie's family. They feel alive, chaotic, funny, and genuinely loving. That's what gives this movie its heart. But this is also its biggest problem, as the cast is so big that not everyone gets equal development. Jamie Zack is supposed to be the centaur, but a lot of the time it feels like he's reacting to things instead of driving things. Even Alberto's death doesn't hit as hard as it should, because this movie is juggling too much at once. Jenny is actually one of the stronger characters. She has a great family history and personality, even if most of it is told through exposition. Unfortunately, the same does not go for her relationship with Jamie, as she is lacking motivation. A few extra scenes of them just connecting would have gone a long way. The villain also feels undercooked. Victor Cord has an interesting idea behind her, but the movie never explores her POV. So she ends up feeling more like a plot device instead of a character. But the one thing this movie absolutely nails, it's the setting. Palmer City looks incredible, especially at night, with all the neon lights. It gives this movie a very distinct identity. Blue Beetle is not perfect, but has enough heart to get it into citizen tier. Forgive me for my sin. But part 1 to The Dark Knight Returns, a nostalgic masterpiece for most, just does not do it for me. It feels like a movie that is just constantly setting things up with no payoff. The pacing is all over the place. It takes a long time to get Batman back in action. And even when he does, the story still feels like it's stalling for something. Bruce's depression is there, but it feels like it never really lands because it's only told in quick flashes instead of being explored properly. It ends up feeling distant and random instead of intentional. The animation also does not help. A lot of the characters feel oddly similar, and the lack of depth and shading makes everything feel very flat at times. And because the runtime is so tight, nothing ever really gets to breathe. It feels less like a complete story and more like a half chapter in Batman's story. Honestly, I would just skip this movie and go straight to part 2. Again, I am very sorry, but this movie must be banished. Shazam is all about one thing for me: heart. This movie is not trying to be a big world-ending event. It's just a simple story about a kid who gets superpowers. And that simplicity is what makes it work. Darla is easily one of the best parts. She brings so much warmth and energy every time she's on screen. The energy is infectious in the best way. Billy Batson, on the other hand, is just having the time of his life with his superpowers. But even then, this movie's charm carries it through. The movie knows exactly what it's trying to be and is not interested in being more. I'm gonna put this movie in hero tier. And as a reward for such a job well done, actually going to say this is better than Aquaman. I have mixed feelings on The Flash, because I really want to like it more than I actually do. The movie is trying to be about trauma, loss, and letting go, but those ideas do not always land the way they should. The movie never gives enough emotional weight to make those themes hit. Dad is a perfect example. The arrest is so simplified and unbelievable that it basically comes down to he was holding his dead wife, therefore he's guilty. And because it's that flimsy, it never gives Barry's trauma enough weight. So remember, kids, if your loved one dies, don't ever grieve them, otherwise you could go to jail for their murder. Instead of feeling like a tragic and complicated injustice, the alternate Barry is pushed so far into the comedic direction that the tone starts to feel a little confused. There are ideas here I have respect for, but they are not developed in a way that feels satisfying. So for me, I'd say it lands in a high Arkham Asylum tier. The Dark Knight Returns Part 2 is where everything finally clicked for me. The story now has a clear direction, and it actually feels like it's building towards something instead of just existing. Batman and Robin's relationship becomes the heart of this movie. It's no longer about an older Bruce coming back. It's about learning to work together and finding purpose in that. Superman's presence also hits much harder this time. Their fight is not just action for the sake of it. It feels like two completely different ideologies finally colliding. Only downside is you can still see the limitations of the animation and the budget. Some details are rough around the edges, and it shows. With characters like Robin and Yindel wearing the same glasses. I guess that means there's only one glasses store in Gotham. But honestly, it does not kill the experience for me, because the story itself is strong enough to carry it. I think for saving part 1, this movie is a hero. Superman Legacy is a very back to basics approach. And that is exactly why it works, especially for a DC reboot. David Cornsweet really sells Superman with his calm and confident energy that makes him feel like a true Superman, a symbol of hope, plucked straight from the comics. The movie also does a great job reintroducing us to Metropolis without making it overwhelming or confusing. It just lets you understand things as you go. But the conflict itself is where it gets a little shaky. The idea of the whole city turning on Superman because of a message from his parents is laughable. Especially because this movie spends so much time showing us why Superman is someone they should trust. The focus is really on Superman, Lois Lane, and Lex Luthor. Lex is one of the highlights. His dynamic with Superman is hilarious. It sounds like he's enjoying the rivalry, like it's all a game for him. That dynamic really carries a lot of this movie. At its core, it's just a classic Superman story done with pride. And that alone makes this movie a hero. Aquaman 2 has some really interesting ideas, even if it doesn't always know what to do with them. Introducing something really creative and then completely forgetting about it in the next scene. The lost civilization, built out of shipwrecks, is exactly what I'm talking about. A very cool and interesting idea that I would love to learn more about, but quickly becomes irrelevant. The visuals are also a huge improvement. You can really see how far the technology has come, especially with all the beautiful underwater colors. Turning Aquaman into Superdad is kind of a funny concept at first, even if it goes on for way too long. The ending speech also has a nice message that brings it all together, even if there's not really much to bring together. There is a lot of potential here, it just doesn't fully execute it. You could say it's a citizen. Birds of Prey is a movie that exists. That's really the only way to describe this movie. Its biggest problem is its story. The thin plot revolves around Harley trying to get back a stolen diamond. The narration is supposed to make things fun, but a lot of the times it just feels redundant and unnecessary because Harley explains what she just did or is about to do. The first half especially feels like it's just walking around in nonsense land until it finally understands what it wants to do. And Cassandra is probably the worst part. Her character feels so inconsistent, with one version in the first half where she's this very quiet outsider, and then in the second half it's like she can't shut up. The rest of the characters don't add much of an impression either. I honestly forgot to remember their names because this movie treats them like they're non-existent. It's no surprise to anyone, but banishment tier. Wonder Woman 1984 is a really strange and shallow movie. It wants to be a heartwarming story of loss and grief, but they do it in the most uncomfortable way possible. The romance with Steve has a huge ick factor because the reunion happens at the expense of some random innocent guy whose body gets taken over. Diana also feels very different here. Instead of someone who is incredibly wise and at least trying to move on, she's just really snarky and turning everyone away. And that makes the movie's message harder to connect with. Maxwell Lord is actually one of the more tolerable characters, because at least he is trying to fix his crummy life. Barbara has potential, but they never spent enough time building her motivations and character. So her transformation feels very shallow and out of nowhere. And honestly, I just don't want to talk about this movie anymore. Wonder Woman 1984, for being the worst, most uncomfortable DC movie, you are rewarded with banishment. Wow, 3 stinkers back to back. Batman, take the wheel and show us how it's done. The Batman is such an interesting movie because it feels less like a superhero movie and more like a Gotham simulator. The best example is Batman himself. The action does not show him as a hero. Instead, it makes you feel the fear that criminals have when he appears. Batman is becoming a legend. I also love the ambition of the characters, with Penguin and Catwoman being just as important to the story as Batman. They feel like major pieces of Gotham's story, making the whole movie feel bigger. The 3-hour runtime may not be as well used as other movies that we're going to talk about, as sometimes it focuses so much on atmosphere that the characters do not change and grow as much as I would like them to. But by the end, everyone understands their flaws, and I couldn't be more excited for Batman Part 2 coming out next year. It's not my favorite Batman, but it is still one of the most interesting. We got ourselves one of the strongest heroes. I do not understand Man of Steel. To be clear, there are parts that I find very interesting, but the way they put everything together just doesn't do it for me. The biggest issue is the structure. The movie constantly jumps back and forth from the past and the present, without always making it clear where we are. It feels like two different stories fighting for attention. It also has a habit of answering questions that no one really ever asked, scientifically breaking down how Superman's powers work. And I think that reveals the deeper problem. Superman is a character that is built on hope, optimism, and a little bit of fantasy. Just a tiny little bit. Tiny little bit. Trying to make him more realistic takes that away. A realistic Batman, like what we got with the Dark Knight trilogy, makes perfect sense. A realistic Superman is much harder to balance. There are cool ideas here, but they just never come together. This god needs to be banished. I can see why the original 1989 Batman is such a classic. This movie just has so much personality. The Joker is honestly my second favorite version of this character. Sorry, but there's no topping Heath Ledger. But Jack Nicholson's Joker is still a lot of fun, because he is clearly having the time of his life. The parade scene shows this perfectly. He is not as terrifying or unpredictable as other Jokers, but he is entertaining. Batman is also a great character because so much of his story is told visually, like the dinner scene. And of course, the score is incredible. It gives Gotham this larger-than-life feeling that makes this whole movie stand out. Even if other Batman have outshined this hero, he definitely deserves to be remembered in the Hall of Justice. If you have not figured it out yet, I'm a nerd who loves world building. So Wonder Woman gets a lot of extra brownie points for having the most expansive world ever thought up. This movie understands that Wonder Woman is not just a hero. She comes from an entire mythology. Everything from the Amazons to the gods feels like there's a story behind it. And that makes this whole world feel bigger. The characters are also a huge strength. Diane and Steve Trevor both have such clear personalities and backstories, which makes their love story feel all the more believable. You understand why they connect. The music also deserves credit. Adds so much emotion to Diana's journey and makes the big moments hit harder. The heart, the characters, and mythology carry this movie. Another Hall of Justice. The Dark Knight Rises is not as good as The Dark Knight, but it is a really strong thematic end to the trilogy. Bane is a really interesting villain at first, especially with how he is introduced so early, immediately feeling like a real threat. But the pacing around him is a little strange, especially when the story pauses his presence and brings him back later. The first fight between him and Batman is also the worst action scene, with Batman losing miserably, making him look weak. And that sets the tone for everything that follows. Talia, as the final big bad, feels a bit rushed. Enough time to fully establish herself before the ending kicks in. But the themes of fear, pain, and legacy all come together in a really satisfying way. Batman's journey especially works on a symbolic level, as he finally reaches a point where he lets Batman go and accept that Gotham is ready for its next protector. The final shot of Bruce being buried next to his parents is beautiful. It's not a perfect movie, but it has a damn good ending. A strong citizen with so much potential to be a hero. Batman Begins feels like the movie that had to exist for everything in the trilogy to work. It is Batman's full origin story, and that takes time. Building who Bruce Wayne is before he becomes the hero. What makes this strong is how grounded it feels. Bruce's training, his fear, and his decision to become Batman all feel like steps in his journey. Ra's al Ghul is a great villain conceptually because, in a weird way, he's actually not wrong. He just takes his ideas of fear and justice way too far. The only real issue is that it splits its villain time between 3 different characters, which makes the story feel a little crowded at times. But even with that, the emotional core of Bruce's journey stays strong. The moment where Wayne Manor is burnt down is especially strong, symbolizing the death of Bruce Wayne as Batman takes his place. The movie does not try to build everything at once. It just starts us off with something incredibly solid that the future movies can build on. Batman Begins is the runway that let the rest of the trilogy take off. A really strong citizen. For me, the biggest surprise was Zack Snyder's Justice League. This movie completely changed my opinion on what a movie could be with an extended 3-hour runtime, becoming every nerd's wet dream with so many fascinating stories and concepts. Dark Superman, the Mother Box, the future we never got. Because of this, the Justice League coming together is only part of the story. The real focus is the coming darkness, the absence of Superman, and Steppenwolf's mission. All those extra stories make the team matter. The action is also incredible and makes Steppenwolf one of the most impactful and important characters. He does not feel like the villain the bad guys need to beat. He feels like a threat. Even when some of these ideas only get a small amount of screen time, they make the world feel so much bigger and more interesting. And that is what this movie understands. A crossover works when the story and characters come first, not because everyone is finally on screen together. This feels like the Justice League we were promised. The crown jewel of the DCEU, and also the Hall of Justice. After all the chaos of the last Suicide Squad, I'm glad we got one that understands why the idea is interesting. This movie works because it does not repeat the same mistakes of the first one. The team is already established, so we can focus on telling a good story. Instead of the predictable, we hate each other but we become friends, it does something far more interesting. It shows these people can do terrible things and yet still have humanity. Every character gets at least one moment to be vulnerable, making the family dynamic far more believable and actually kind of sweet. These are bad guys, but that does not mean they are bad people. And that is what gives this movie its heart. The only character that feels a little underdeveloped is Peacemaker. But considering they were already working on a spin-off show for him, I completely understand. Hall of Justice, but maybe an honorary member. I was honestly blown away by Mask of the Phantom. And unlike other sloppy interpretations of Batman, which we have and will talk about, this feels like a movie version of Batman the Animated Series. What surprised me most was how much heart this movie has. The relationship between Batman and Andrea is genuinely great. There are so many cute moments of the two of them when they were younger. You actually believe these two were once in love. Andrea is also a great character by herself, and her chemistry with Bruce is phenomenal. When they're together, it feels like they can just forget about their shared trauma and just be happy again. She also gives Bruce a real reason to consider giving up Batman. Not because he's tired, not because he wants an easier life, though both those things are true if you think about it, but that's not the point. But because he can finally see a chance at happiness. The scene with Bruce with his parents at the cemetery are haunting because they force Bruce to question whether his mission is worth losing his life over. It's emotional, tragic, and one of the best examples of knowing who Batman is. It's a Hall of Justice. Peacemaker Season 2 is a weird one for me, because it's not disaster. I understand why people enjoy it, but it also doesn't really capture what made the first season so special. The biggest problem is that it feels like the show has lost its heart. The first season worked because underneath all the jokes and violence, it was a story about people who loved each other. Here, a lot of the emotional connection feels missing. Everyone is much harsher towards Chris, and some of the conflict feels like it's just there to create drama instead of revealing something deeper. Harcourt especially feels like a missed opportunity. Her conflict is not developed enough, so it mostly comes across as angry outbursts getting into fights for no reason. Chris is the only one who feels like he has a clear journey, and that connects to my bigger issue, the pacing. The alternate universes are introduced right away, but the bigger twist does not come until the last few episodes. That leaves very little time to explore the actual consequences of the twist. As I said before, the season is not that bad, but compared to season 1, it's kind of a letdown. For those reasons, I think I can put this in the middle or average citizen. Supergirl is a movie with a lot of potential, and a generally sweet story about a girl trying to save her dog, but it struggles due to its rushed, emotionally distant pacing, continuing to move characters and other pieces before they are ready, never giving the big moments enough build-up. I also think the themes of revenge are very confusing, as they don't really pick a side. They just say revenge is bad, and gets even more backwards at the end when they say revenge is the answer, as Supergirl kills the villain. Arkham Asylum on very thin ice. I am all DC'd out. Let's just get this over with. I have never seen a movie that feels more like a vanity project than Dwayne Johnson's Black Adam. He seems more interested in making Black Adam an action figure rather than an actual character. A lot of the other characters get pushed aside. The Justice Society especially, with most of these characters serving Black Adam instead of having their own roles. The romance also feels incredibly rushed, with characters going from barely knowing each other to having a deep connection without the movie owning it. The performances feel so stiff and serious. They rarely feel like real characters. Did I like anything about this movie? Well, no. Banishment. Shazam! Fury of the Gods really misses the point of what made the first movie work. The original had heart, charm, and a strong focus on family. This one is basically asking, now what? A lot of the fun personality from the first movie is now gone. Instead of building on the characters, it moves them through a pretty standard superhero plot. It also makes some really strange choices, especially with the romance with Freddy, that takes away so much of what made the first movie fun. Even the emotional beats don't hit the same way, because the weird implications and imagery are so distracting. The villain side of things also feels underwhelming, with motives that are never explored in a meaningful way. There are moments that are fine enough on their own, but compared to the first movie, this one is a big step backwards. So unfortunately, this one is going to need to get lost, as it is banished from DC. Injustice surprised me in a really good way. The animation has some seriously snazzy shading that makes everything look 3D. The visuals just pop. The background, especially the sunset shots, look incredible. Almost like painted artwork. But what really works is how fast the story gets going. Within minutes, everything changes. Joker kills Lois Lane, and Superman's world collapses. And from there, the movie starts asking interesting questions. Can a hero save everyone? And is Batman partly responsible for Lois Lane's death? Unlike a lot of other DC ensemble projects, this one uses its characters correctly. Even the smallest cameos feel like they matter to the story. Not everything gets wrapped up in a nice little bow, but honestly, I was too invested to care. It's bold, fast, and ridiculous, and that's what makes it fun. It's a hero. Batman vs Superman feels like DC got hit with Marvel fever and tried to skip about 5 steps of setup. The idea is interesting on paper, but I'm just going to say what we're all thinking. Marvel did it better. Batman barely feels like he gets his own story. And instead of building to a natural crossover, the movie just pushes everyone together because Justice League needs to happen. It feels like it's rushing towards something bigger instead of focusing on what's in front of it. This also makes Justice League less special because they already pulled the crossover card. Superman also feels underdeveloped in his own movie, which makes the emotional weight of his choices harder to connect with. And because this movie is so focused on setting up Justice League that it never really gets a chance to stand on its own. It is not confident in what it's trying to be. And that uncertainty shows up a lot. And honestly, this movie is actually hilariously bad. The kind of bad that's actually fun to sit through. Just so you can point at the screen and say, what is happening? There are moments that do look cool and are very ambitious on paper, but the story never fully commits to any of them. Not only a banishment, but a shameful, ridiculous one. After watching all these movies, I think DC's biggest problem was never that it was different, it was that DC stopped trusting what made it different. The best movies on this list are not trying to be Marvel. They're just DC in its purest form. And when it remembers that, it can create something truly special.